Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study here at New Covenant House. We are now embarking on a new series, and it's not actually a book, but it is our governing document. Looks like this. And we'll, in the next few weeks or so, we will try to find out what New Covenant House is. Maybe a little bit about what it isn't, but definitely what I hope that it will become. And I really wanted it to be a discussion and guided by the people who are watching here with your questions. So I encourage you to let me know what you're thinking. But I can understand that you need a little bit of background to start doing that. So tonight, we're going to look at some definitions. If you came here from our Facebook group, New Covenant House Friends and Family, you will know that the introduction is a vision study. So we have to define a little bit about what vision is. And you'll also see words like monasticism and maybe community, what that means. So let's jump in and talk about vision. Vision has something to do with seeing things. So a vision is something that you see at a distance, something in the future. So my vision for this community is that we will be a new Jerusalem, a new way of living life. So the next question then becomes, how do you do that? And I have decided that the best way to do that is to read the Bible, particularly the New Testament, and in that focus mostly on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and 6. But the whole Bible is obviously necessary to do that. But Jesus said at one point or another that he said that the two commandments, he wasn't really meaning commandment that you are you're punished if you don't follow them, but he means that the things that you need to do to get to where you want to be, which is the kingdom of God, the New Jerusalem, then there are two things you need to do. Well, number one, you need to love God with everything you have in you. And the second thing is almost like it is, you need to love your neighbor as yourself. So those two things are action things. Those are the things that you do. I know they're extremely broad, and that's deliberate. That gives us something to talk about later on, because that's what we're going to do. In following sessions here, we're going to put some meat on those and determine what exactly that means. But what about the things you do? Can you just do anything you want? Anything that gets you to the goal? That the means can be anything, but I'm sure if you are like most people, you have some limitations about what you are willing to do. Would you willing to murder? Are you willing to steal? Are you willing to lie? So the things that guide that are called values. So there are certain things that are important to us, and those are things that guide our everyday lives. We treat people well. We don't yell at them. We don't put them down, or things like that. Those are called values, and there's a way, there are some books written that can help you determine that, what those are. So in other words, the values is the beginning. This what drives you, what it determines who you are, and because they do that, they determine what you do, the way you do it, and because of that, then that will get you to your vision for a new world. So those are the three things that are important for a vision in any organization. As a matter of fact, you can apply those to any task that you have to do. You can see that we have to, if your task is to have a series of studies that will lead to an understanding of what New Covenant House is about, you will have a vision that says that we're going to have a study. The end goal is for listeners to know what New Covenant House is about. And the way we're going to do it is through some studies, weekly studies, and the value that guides that is our desire that people will have an understanding of what New Covenant House is about, because we think that this is a good thing to do. It's a good way of living life. So that was a little bit about vision, and we're going to dig deeper into that in the coming weeks. But I also think that you might want to ask yourself, what is a monastic community? And there are plenty of myths about that. People typically associate monasteries or cloisters with the Roman Catholic Church. And that's no coincidence, because before the Reformation there was only the Catholic Church, and that's when the first monasteries appeared. Actually, I think most people recognize now that a fellow named Anthony was the first one to move into the desert to get his purpose, I think, was to get closer to Jesus, learning about who Jesus was and how to live the way he wanted us to. That started in the 3rd century, so a couple of hundred years after the crucifixion, and the church had already began to fall apart. It had already begun to unravel, and as people were in positions of power, they kind of reverted to the old ways before Jesus came. And I think that was one of the things that motivated Anthony to move out into the desert. So others followed, and I think one of the next important people in that sequence is Benedict, who was the first one to actually write down what he thought a monastery should be like. He called it a rule of life. And that is our equivalent here. A monastery is really just a community that is, I think the word means something like alone or isolated. And we're going to get back to that a little later, maybe in another session, how we separate ourselves from the world that has been completely corrupt. And we need time to step back and get in touch with Jesus again and kind of form a society, a strategy for how to return to Him. So, and then I think another milestone that came about was the Reformation. And Luther himself was a monk, I guess a Catholic monk, because there was nothing else but Catholicism at that time. And that is why he could become excommunicated. Later on, there are, I just heard an interview with a young lady who wanted to become a nun. So the first thing she did was to communicate with Catholic nuns, thinking that monasteries are associated with the Catholic Church. But they immediately, someone immediately recognized that she would be more aligned with Anglicans. So she found an Anglican monastery or convent in England, where she has been living ever since. So that was like something that changed monasteries, because now Luther himself married. He had a wife and children, I guess. Celibacy was no longer a requirement for living in a monastery. And modern day monasteries, they will typically accept that if you want to live in celibacy, you can, but it definitely also accepts couples. Actually, here at New Covenant's house, I think we would want to encourage that, because we know that the future is the children. If we can grow from inside, then I think it would be easier than to grow the movement that we want to create from the outside. There's also another word I want to touch a little bit upon. It's called cloister, and that is like you turn your back on something. We have physically the building. It has typically a courtyard with four sides, and you always have your back onto the world. The only place you go would be in this courtyard. But I think the movement is moving away from that too. And many modern monasteries, many of them don't call themselves monasteries, and it took a little while for me to figure out what I wanted to do here. But I think we want to emphasize that we are returning to that. We're not just another way of creating an intentional community, because intentional communities can be many, many, many different things, and monastic life is just one of those many things. And we want to make sure that people understand that this life here is centered on Christ, and we have a specific purpose for doing that. So that's a little bit about definitions here. Oh yeah, let me just mention some of the modern attempts of making monasteries. There's this book here, written I don't know when, but it's by a community called Rupa House, and there are several authors here, and they wanted to define, similar to what Benedict was doing, define what a modern monastery would look like. And there are 12 writers who each wrote a chapter describing some of the things that were important to them. And the first one they come up with is that they relocate to the abandoned places of the empire. So they talk about the empire, which is like an image of the world, the way people normally live, because we think that it is, or many people think that it is violent and it's deceptive and it's exploitative. So that is the bad place. Empire is bad. Monastery is good. So there are some examples. Koinonia Farm is one of these modern day monasteries. Rupa House, Weber Fellowship. I think also we could mention maybe Jesus People in Chicago, which is also similar to, in the 1960s were the hippie movement, and one hippie was Chuck Smith. He founded the Calvary Chapel movement, which is a very, very conservative movement of Christians that formed, like, there are now 1,500 churches worldwide, and but they're not monasteries, they're just regular churches. But it's part of the movement anyway, because it the idea was to bring Jesus to these hippie people and introduce them to Jesus. I can't think of any other ones, but there are also some organizations that organize monastic communities. One of them is Nurturing Community. Nurturing Communities Network. I've been to one of their gatherings in Kentucky last year. There is a new one I just came across, was Ecclesia Project, and so there are organizations that are specifically for Christian intentional communities. I intend to disassociate myself from the Foundation for Intentional Communities, because I'm not likely to find anybody in that organization that will be resonating with what we're trying to do here. There are very few. There are some Christian organizations within it, but the vast majority are more like co-housing, which is more like a land development scheme, and there's eco-villages, but we don't really have much to do with them. Although there's some one of the writers in here in the School for Conversion from Rupa House and talk about the environment, but yeah, so that's what we're going to be doing. So I think next week would be the best way to start that would be for me to, I really hate to do that, but I think I need to give you some background of where I'm coming from, so that you'll know how all this came about in the first place. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. So I hope to see you back here next week at the same time.